Hello, my lovely little gemstones. It's Vera, and today I'm going to be reading A Game of Vice, Chapter 5, written by Coconut Cluster. Chapter 5, Three Musketeers. The bird things had been watching him for some time now. Well, watching was a choice term, considering they didn't seem to have eyes. Roman held back a wince as the one perched on the window ledge turned his head to him with a snap. But empty sockets, and they stared from their vantage points with sightless vigilance, searing into him when those hollows found his gaze. Were they vultures? They had the same hunched posture, an air of hunger and macabre, but their feathers glinted green under the dim light of the storm clouds outside the tower. An ebony coat dipped in acid. If they were vultures, Roman wasn't eager to see what they scavenged. There had only been a few when he'd first arrived, shadows in the distant sky, but Remus's twisted landscape seemed to be crawling with them now. They passed by the window in the dozens, swarming under the darkening sky in black masses, swooping to the treetops at odd intervals and pausing every so often to sit on the window ledge and tilt their grotesque heads at Roman. He couldn't tell if they knew he was there. He didn't dare move in their presence, 10 feet away yet still too close to their hooked, gleaming beaks. It's not like he actually had a choice to move anyway. His wrists were red, scratched raw by now, though he had stopped struggling against the rope some time ago, and his breathing was reduced to shallow bursts of air between the rope at his chest and the cloth in his mouth. He didn't see the point of restraints. Where would he go? Hundreds of feet from the ground with no exit but a hole in the wall? He didn't even have his sword. He had no escape, no fighting chance, no certainty that someone was actually coming for him, not even a hope of negotiation at this point. Remus had reappeared earlier, after nearly an hour of being gone, and promptly ignored Roman's muffled attempt at a pleaded treaty, face shadowed and drawn as he sent a scathing glare at the prince before turning to the window and shooing away one of the horrid birds with a sharp wave of his hand. Roman bit hard on the gag to keep in a surprised cry as Remus drew his sword and threw it across the room without turning from the window, putting his head in his hands and curling his fists into his hair, silvery tufts trapped in his white-knuckled grip. The Duke didn't say a word, and it terrified Roman more than the creatures in tower and storm put together. He wanted to reach out to him. It was an uncharacteristic urge, that's what he remarked to himself, a blatant lie. But it was there, a whim to reach out and pull Remus's hands into his own and hold on for dear life, and there was a choked feeling in his chest that accompanied it. He wanted to see his brother's eyes, and more. He wanted to see that juvenile joy, that chaotic fervor sparkling in them instead of the coldness that leached their color now. As if on cue, Remus turned from where he stood hunched before the window, turning that murky gaze on Roman, his mouth a taut line. They stared at each other in silence. Again, not that Roman had a choice, as Remus studied him. It was only with a much too close peal of thunder that the Duke tore his eyes from his brother and turned back to the window. Roman couldn't help but feel he'd failed some unspoken test, and for the millionth time today he wanted nothing more than to apologize, though he didn't really know what he was apologizing for anymore. Everything, maybe. Everything he'd done to make Remus this way. It was his fault, he knew it. He'd mulled it over countless times in this godforsaken tower. But there was nothing he could say, even if he could speak now, that could fix it. Remus looked at the sky. The dark clouds had finally gathered above them, letting loose the first drops of rain, and disappeared, and a bird took his place once more. If one more bird nosedived at him, Deceit was going to start skewering them. They were nuisances while he walked, with their horrid screeches and ugly, eyeless faces. Ugly, he muttered aloud to himself as one perched on a branch near his head and stretched its gnarled neck down toward him. But now, as he and the others sat on the path to rest their feet, Virgil had twisted his ankle on a spare piece of debris. They were bones. Deceit knew they knew that, but they seemed insistent on calling them debris, so he humored them. And Patton insisted they all take a break before they tired themselves completely anyway. The vulturous creatures seemed to find glee in diving at their heads before turning up at the last moment and cackling away as they soared back into the sky. The first signs of rain rolling in overhead did nothing to deter them either. At least he had more composure than the others. Every time those strident calls pierced the air again, Virgil jumped, eyes wide, and Patton looked ready to pass out again. The only other side who didn't seem fazed was, unsurprisingly, Logan. He was an odd character, Deceit decided as he watched the logical side crouch down and sift through the path's various pieces of bone, debris, and pebbles. He was a bit uptight, but he was by far the most level-headed and tolerable of the light sides. Deceit quite liked his little intellectual rambles. At least one of them had a brain cell. There was, of course, the whole issue of I don't have feelings, but everyone has a character flaw, he supposed. Besides, Logan's grasp of the other side's feelings far outweighed the misunderstanding of his own. He alone was able to calm Virgil's anxieties and rein in Patton's hysterics as they traveled through Remus's nightmarescape. So perhaps Deceit respected him on some level, if only for making this godforsaken trip a little quieter. A noise from the trees caught his attention suddenly, tearing him from his character analysis, which was a very normal activity to preoccupy oneself with and was not weird at all when he thought about it a moment later. He turned, expecting to find another bird leering at him from the shadows, but the gaps in the trees were empty of anything but darkness. He leaned forward, peering past knotted trunks. You shouldn't look in there. Deceit practically jumped out of his skin, which he always feared was an actual possibility, given the whole snake thing, and whipped around to face the interruption, a scowl already on his face. It faded a bit when he saw who it was. Logan had settled on the path beside him, hands in his lap and posture ridiculously straight despite his crisscross pattern. Mouth scrunched to the side while he waited for Deceit to recover from the startle. He raised one unimpressed eyebrow as the snake-faced side took a deep breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. Why not? Deceit said after a moment. You haven't seen it yet? Seen what? He all but snapped, eyeing Logan's pursed expression as the logical side's gaze flickered to the forest behind him and back to the ground. Deceit could practically see the gears whirring in his head. Finally, Logan nodded towards the trees and waited for Deceit to look, face set with solemnity as the snake-faced side did just that. There was nothing, just as Deceit had seen a few minutes ago. There was nothing, just as Deceit had seen a few moments ago, just shadows and tree limbs and weird, disembodied noises. He waited, watched, but his eyes started to strain against the darkness. He blinked hard and sighed again, debating whether or not Logan was actually crazy and Deceit just wildly misjudged him. Just as he went to turn back and make some biting remark that would shoo the logical side back to where Patton was examining Virgil's twisted ankle, Logan murmured, There. Deceit blinked, and he saw it. It was murky at first. It was, itself, made of shadows, nearly indistinguishable from the darker ones surrounding it. But as Deceit focused on it, it became clearer. It was a human figure, shoulders hunched and arms wrapped around itself, head hung ever so slightly. A few feet away were more figures with their backs turned to the first, though they turned at odd intervals to jeer, jabbing accusing fingers at the solitary figure, who didn't react but to curl its arms tighter. They had no faces, no distinctive features, and yet a painful ache swallowed Deceit as he watched, forcing his eyebrows to furrow as he blinked away the stinging pressure in his eyes. No distinctive features, but the lonely figure was wearing his hat. What is that? He said quietly without tearing his eyes from the scene. Logan broke his own clouded gaze from the forest to glance at Deceit, examining his drawn expression with grim curiosity. I'm not sure what I'd call it, he started, but it appears to be some reenactment of insecurities, or fears, perhaps. Remus has a talent for digging up repressed thoughts. He went silent, staring into the trees again before turning away and rolling his shoulders with a corrective cough. I imagine it's altered for each viewer. It's Remus. What? With a thick swallow, Deceit pointed at the scene. It morphed before his eyes, the shadow of his hat melting away. Replaced by wisps of wild hair, the figure's shoulder decorated with puffed sleeves that fanned out at the wrists, still grasping its sides in a desperate self-hug. It was Remus, clear as day. The figures jeering at him grew more aggressive as Deceit and Logan watched, pointing and throwing their heads back in laughter as he shrunk back. Logan gave a small, flabbergasted, "Oh, interesting," the logical side murmured, leaning forward and squinting into the forest to try and see it better. Perhaps Remus is too good at digging up repressed thoughts. He and Deceit fell quiet as the shadow people slowly faded into the darkness, then melted back into their original forms, and they both looked away as the scene started over again. Well, Deceit broke the silence, straightening his spine. But Logan didn't respond. He just stared at his hands folded neatly in his lap, dark bangs spilling onto his forehead as he pressed his lips together tightly. He did that a lot, Deceit noticed, went silent and contemplated, let his thoughts sit and develop before he spoke, like he was afraid of giving anything half-baked. So Deceit waited. Sure enough, the logical side finally raised his head, eyes narrowing at nothing in particular as he said, Remus is worsening. I've noticed. I assumed you had. Has he been troubled before this excursion? Deceit snorted, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning back against a tree trunk. He's always troubled, Logan. Fair point. He leveled a thoughtful look at Deceit. May I ask you something? I reserve the right not to answer, but go ahead. Why did you really come with us? Deceit's easy smirk fell as he bristled. He'd given a whole speech about that, all for naught, apparently. I've told you why. And I believe you. I was just wondering if there was another reason. They watched each other for a moment. Logan would be killer in a staring contest, until Deceit huffed an irritated sigh and sank further down against the tree, resigning himself to the truth. Stupid logic. I was worried about Remus. Logan just raised his eyebrows and waited for him to continue. He doesn't hate Roman, you know, the snake-faced side said, shifting uncomfortably in his spot. He can be excessively vile toward him, But he's not cruel. Not like this, I mean. Something's wrong with him right now. Deceit's thoughts flashed back to Remus's face in the Otherscape living room, the flicker of dejection and pain in his eyes before they went dark, and the ache in Deceit's chest returned. He's just taking it out on the first person he can think to blame. He glanced across the path at where Patton was narrating some story with bright gestures, while Virgil listened with a small smile. Then at Logan, who watched him with careful eyes. "I know Remus is an anomaly you all would rather ignore," he said lowly. "But he's my friend. I want him and Roman both to be okay." He didn't know what he expected Logan's response to be. A sigh, maybe, irritated and dismissive. Maybe he'd yell. He had quite a temper at times. Or maybe he'd just purse his lips and go back to sit beside Patton, act like their conversation never happened. Or maybe he'd nod sagely and say, in a surprisingly gentle tone, "Well, then we'll do our best to make sure they are." Deceit met his eyes, saw a matter-of-fact sincerity sparkling in them. It struck him suddenly that dealing with Virgil and Patton and Roman all the time mandated a sort of empathy. How odd, then, that Logan never seemed to boast his wide scope of interpersonality. Maybe he was more than just tolerable. He couldn't think of a response that seemed adequate for the promise, so he just nodded, and just like Deceit suspected he would, Logan understood it. Roman almost wished the birds had stayed instead of the storm. The rain had been gentle at first, sprinkling from the charcoal clouds overhead, but it quickly turned to something heavier, one step short of a downpour, effectively cleansing the high air of the vultures, which Roman had hesitantly decided to label them. The rain itself wasn't bad. It actually reminded him of gloomy afternoons in the living room, watching Disney with Virgil, or baking with Patton, or brainstorming with Logan while a deluge of rain danced outside the window. It had, at first, brought a welcome sense of comfort and familiarity to him. But then it fell harder, and the distant thunder got much, much less distant, and it was the certainty that this wasn't the worst of the storm that finally got to him. He tried distancing himself. Before, right after Remus had brought him here and disappeared for the first time, Roman had sung to himself, Disney and Broadway and any and all lyrics that popped into his head. He couldn't exactly do that now. Remus had tossed a rock over his shoulder at him when Roman had started humming idly, which a small cut on his cheekbone now attested to. So he just closed his eyes, tried to breathe deeply, and thought. He thought about his side of the imagination. He thought of the rolling hills, the quaint villages and quainter villagers, the bright-eyed forest creatures and colorful plants and clear blue skies. He tried to remember every detail of the pond he liked to sit by after difficult days. The fuzzy patches of moss on its rocky perimeter, the charming little koi fish that darted below its surface, the cool kiss of a breeze that seemed to wrap him in a hug and brush his hair from his face and dance across his skin, the contentedness of looking down into the water and seeing his reflection, rippling and tinted blue, but undeniably him and no one else. He thought reluctantly of creativity. Not him or Remus, but him. The whole to their halves, the them before they were them. It wasn't the first time a distant image of the side he'd never truly known crossed his mind. He'd stayed awake countless nights trying to remember what it was like to be him. Did he have a name? Had he chosen one before being torn in two? Roman didn't know, but the mystery just made the ethereal image of him in his mind all the more looming, commanding and infinitely unreal. All in vain. Roman was never creativity, the actual creativity. Had never been a latent facet of him just waiting to surface. He had no memories of his days. Did the other sides miss him? Surely Virgil hadn't been around yet, but Patton and Logan, maybe even Deceit, they knew him, befriended and loved and grew up with him. Did they ever reminisce? Had they hated Remus and Roman when they replaced the creativity they'd known until then? Roman didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He thought of the others then. He thought of Patton's bubbly encouragements, his sunshine smiles and grounding hugs. He thought of Logan and his stern sincerity, his subtle glints of pride in his eyes when he solved a problem, his wit and curiosity and ridiculous hidden talents. He thought, oddly, or maybe it wasn't so oddly, of Deceit, with his pristine clothing and demeanor and speeches, his enthusiastic love for theater and not-so-hidden love for philosophy and history, the way he side-eyed the others when they laughed or hugged or huddled together for whatever reason. He thought of the old days with Remus, when they'd hang upside down from the top railing of their bunk beds and talk about anything and everything, when Remus would only get angry when one of the other sides hurt Roman's feelings or belittled his ideas, when Roman would play a dashing prince on his way to battle the fearsome and legendary dragon witch Remus, and they'd duel with crudely made cardboard rapiers, and sometimes Roman would emerge victorious on the carcass of the fallen beast that was just Remus's dragon onesie, and and sometimes the paper cutout villagers would lament the tragic death of their hero as the dragon witch held his tissue paper crown high in the air like a trophy. It was a gutting pain that followed that particular train of thought, but he couldn't seem to make himself stop writing it. He thought quite a lot of Virgil. Maybe because it had been the anxious side he had hoped so dearly would hear his and Remus's commotion outside his door. It was difficult to believe that had only been this afternoon. Or maybe because he just desperately wanted a sign, a reminder that everything would be okay. And for some reason, Virgil was, in Roman's head, a sign of home and comfort and contentment. He thought of their debates over breakfast, tossing blueberries at each other and laughing to themselves when Patton went into dad mode about it. And he thought about their Disney marathons, when neither of them could sleep and they found each other shuffling like zombies through the kitchen or living room or hallways. He thought about the furrowed brow scrutiny of Virgil's, the concerned frowns he masked with annoyance when Roman didn't eat or drink or sleep enough during creative binges. He thought about the way Virgil could make hot cocoa without even opening his eyes, practiced enough to do it in his sleep as he shuffled around the kitchen at 3 a.m. with his eyelids drifting shut. He thought of the chicken scratch annotations in Virgil's copy of Grimm's fairy tales, from the remarks about characters and plots to the dates scribbled beside passages, days Virgil had been spiraling and found reprieve in a certain line or paragraph. He always insisted on borrowing Roman's copy for some reason, gave some mumbled excuse about it being in better condition, and a part of Roman hoped it was actually because the anxious side liked the doodles and commentary he wrote in the margins, saw similarities in their interpretations of the stories and the solace they found in them. He thought of Virgil, and he felt a little better. It's getting darker. Virgil gave a low hum in reply, not bothering to follow Deceit's gaze to the sky as he tugged at the edges of his chainmail sleeves. You don't say, Sherlock. Deceit sent him a dry scowl. Logan, he said pointedly, shoving Virgil out of the way and smothering a grin when the anxious side just gave an amused snort. How long have we been walking? Total, or since our last stop? Total. 4 hours, 12 minutes, and 36 seconds. Deceit stopped, swatting Virgil's hand away from where it was tugging at his cape to annoy him, and blinked at the logical side. I forgot you could do that. What? Count down to the second. His gaze flitted to where Logan and Patton's fingers were laced together between them, Patton swinging their hands through the air as he whistled a falsely jaunty tune off-key. Full of surprises, I suppose. He looked back up at the sky without waiting for response or comment and frowned, eyes scanning the clouds still dotted with swooping birds and their hoarse calls. The rain clouds had gathered over their heads now, so it was only a matter of time until the downpour started. He could already see it falling around the tower, which was startlingly and satisfyingly close now. The forest was bad enough on its own. He really didn't want to trek through it in a storm. 4 hours, 12 minutes, and 36 seconds of walking. They wouldn't be able to manage an hour more without fighting a torrent. How long since your challenge? Virgil asked suddenly. His playful smile faded to a frown as his steps slowed, brows furrowed in thought. His eyeshadow had steadily darkened during their trip through the forest, nearly pitch black now. Logan blinked. 2 hours, 54 minutes, and... He paused, scanning the ground for a moment. 40 seconds. Why? He'll be back soon, then, Deceit muttered. It's been too long without chaos. My thoughts exactly, Nagini. Deceit nearly jumped at the voice in his ear, though his body seemed calmer than his thoughts, and stood rooted to his spot as he squeezed his eyes shut and took a deep, careful breath. The others had gone silent in an instant, Virgil falling out of step at his side, and it was in a methodical pivot that the snake-faced side turned to face the problem. Remus didn't grin as their eyes met. There was no wild glint in his gaze, no goofy position on a tree branch or yoga pose in the middle of the path, no convoluted introduction. He just stood silently as Deceit studied him, hands hanging loosely at his sides. Remus? Deceit greeted evenly after a moment. Remus tilted his head to the side, just a bit, a shadow of a smile coloring his face as his eyes inched from Deceit's face to his peripheral, catching a glimpse of the wary faces over his shoulder. It's time. Virgil sucked in a breath from behind Remus, shuffling to Patton's side as the moral side gently grabbed his elbow and tugged him close, his freckled face set with determination. Deceit wanted to join them, form a united front for Remus to face, but the Duke was standing between him and the others as they huddled together. He straightened his spine and raised his chin instead. Time for what? Your challenges, dummy. Plural? Remus rolled his eyes. For a second, Deceit flashed back to the many times the Duke had done the exact same thing with an air of fondness, exasperated when his wild plans were rationalized away for the millionth time. Not just yours, he huffed. You're not that special. I thought I'd be efficient and present your challenge and Virgie's at the same time. Virgil's face went ghostly pale. He looked over Remus's shoulder to meet Deceit's gaze, panic and uncertainty swimming in his eyes, which flickered back to their natural mismatchedness for just a moment, purple and green swirling together in Deceit's mind, with memories of late nights prolonged by nightmares and made-up songs to distract from the anxiety of new people, and pricked fingertips from sewing lessons, and 1,000 more things at once. Remus has a talent for digging up repressed thoughts. Damn it all. All right, then. Opening his arms in a let's have it then gesture, sending Virgil what he hoped was a subtle and reassuring glance. The sooner we get started, the better. Remus's deadpan expression didn't shift. First, he turned, pointing a finger at Patton and Logan, who tugged Virgil behind them and stared the Duke down with a fire that would have genuinely scared Deceit if he was on the receiving end, though Remus seemed unfazed. You two, scram. Logan narrowed his eyes. Excuse me? Scram, Remus repeated, drawing out each letter and waving a hand for them to get lost. Go back the way you came. Make out in the forest. Go back to your humble little abode for all I care. A door appeared behind Patton, white and swimming with black, murky tendrils, the exit back into the mindscape. Just get out. Logan and Patton shared a confused glance, clearly suspecting a trick, but when they didn't move, Remus groaned. It echoed up the valley, a discordant sound that rang uncomfortably long after it stopped. Go, he spat, or I'll shove you in the river like I meant to in the first place. Just go, Virgil whispered to them, nudging them gently towards the door despite Patton's stuttered protest. We'll be fine, I promise. Just go and be ready for us when we get back, okay? Patton looked ready to say no again, but at last he just pressed his lips together and wrapped Virgil in a hug, whispering something to him before pulling away with teary eyes. He and Logan sent Deceit a look at the same time. Patton's was one of concern, aching for a promise that he'd make it out all right. But Logan's expression was hard, a look of stony determination that didn't ask for anything but told Deceit to do what he needed to. Deceit just nodded at both of them. Logan took a deep breath and muttered something to Virgil, something the anxious side nodded quickly to and turned to the door, pushing it open and letting Patton step through before he sent Remus one last steely look. The Duke replied with a bright grin and fluttering wave. It disappeared as soon as the door closed behind them. Now, he said briskly, turning his cold eyes on Virgil and Deceit and offering a joyless smile. Here we are. How touching, isn't it? The three amigos, back together again. He looked at Virgil and shook his head. We'd always be together if someone didn't defect, you know. What are we doing, Remus? Deceit interrupted, crossing his arms across his chest. Remus's gaze snapped to him. Always one to take charge, aren't you, Dee? Always the mother hen, keeping her little chicks in line. Well, I'll tell you what you're doing, if you'd let me get to it. They were draped in silence as Remus raised his chin petulantly, lips pushed out in a pout, and Virgil and Deceit watched him waiting. Finally, Deceit sighed. Please continue, Remus. I'm dying to hear your plans. Remus grinned. Of course you are. He whirled to face Virgil better, either missing or ignoring how the anxious side flinched, and looked him up and down, examining his outfit with a contemplative scowl. I will never understand my brother's fascination with knights, truly. He's such a hopeless romantic. He wrinkled his nose. Makes me sick. Virgil raised a confused eyebrow. What, Virgil? Remus said blankly. Have you not realized it this entire time? You're his knight in shining armor. He mocked in a grating falsetto, face painted with a plastic smile that dropped a mere second later. You want your challenge? Go save your little prince. Finish his adorable fairy tale fantasy and sign it off with happily ever after. Then go to his side of the imagination and honeymoon on a rainbow or something. Like I care. He jerked his head to the tower. It was just past a gap in the trees when Deceit looked up through the beginning of the rainfall, found it looming over them, and he could just see a hole high up in the stone wall. Virgil stared at the tower with wide eyes. There were no stairs, no door to escape or rope to climb. The only thing he had to make it to the window were jagged stone outcrops, painful yet natural footholds. Deceit desperately hoped beyond hope Virgil was no longer afraid of heights. Remus, the snake-faced side started to chide, or plead, he hadn't decided yet, when Virgil broke in. Fine, he snapped. His face darkened with determination as he eyed the tower again, and Deceit could practically see the mantra in his eyes. For Roman, playing on repeat in his head as his hands curled into fists. His wrists were shaking. Deceit realized after a burst of panic that it wasn't fear, it was adrenaline. Fight or flight, no longer a detriment but a benefit for the anxious side at last, and he leveled his gaze on Remus with a dangerous glint. I hope you had your fun, Remus, but the game's over, and with that he turned on his heel and headed for the tower. Remus and Deceit watched him walk off in silence. Deceit felt equal measures pride and nervousness swell in his chest for the anxious side, and he wanted to grab his arm before he was out of sight, tell him to call for him if he needed it, like he used to when Virgil was just thawed into existence and restless in his novelty, when they looked out for each other. He kept his hands on his side and prayed for the first time in years. Do you think he's happier there? Remus asked suddenly, eyes trained on Virgil's fading figure. Do you think it's better with the light sides? Deceit frowned at him, and when Remus looked over, the Duke gave a bitter chuckle. Well, I suppose you'll know yourself soon enough. Deceit's frown just deepened. I'm not going to leave you, Remus. The look in Remus's eyes at that was a storm darker than the one overhead, lightning glinting in his gaze as he raised his head once more. Liars go to hell, Dee, he said grimly, placing a hand on his hip and grasping the hilt that appeared in his palm a second later. He pulled, unsheathing a thin, greenish rapier, scored and stained. Deceit realized with a sinking feeling in his chest that carried his heart down, that the sheath at his own side had housed a golden rapier this whole time. You said you were willing to talk, Remus said, pressing the tip of his sword to Deceit's chest, just hard enough to leave an indent in the leather. So let's talk. I'm not going to fight you. But Remus was already swinging, his face shadowed as the rain began to fall harder around them. Deceit just managed to duck below the first slice of the Duke's sword, scrambling back as he fumbled to pull his own rapier from his sheath. Just to block the thrusting attacks Remus poured down on him. He finally wrangled it free from his belt and held it up, right on time to block a swing at his face. Remus's face twisted with something angry as he leapt back. He didn't wait for Deceit to get up before he was back on the offensive, aiming now for the snake-faced side's hand, which he braced against the ground. Deceit pulled it back at the last second as he glanced wildly around the forest. He refused to fight Remus, but he couldn't block him forever. He needed to get to a place where he could talk to the Duke without being in stabbing range. Another thrust at his shoulder, so the running was a no-go. Talking while blocking would have to do. Remus, he started, voice shaking as he stumbled to the side to avoid a hit to his knee. I know you're hurt, and you— Jesus, Remus was fast. You're angry, I understand, but this solves nothing. He finally managed to grab a low-hanging tree branch and haul himself up, ducking a second later as Remus thrusted his sword forward at the elbow. The blade got stuck in the trunk, so Deceit sprinted behind the Duke and took the advantage to start talking before he freed his blade. I know you've been hurt these past few years, more than anyone deserves, and I'm sorry. I don't know if I've made it worse. I don't care if I haven't. I'm sorry, Remus. He winced as Remus pulled hard at his rapier, knuckles white. You never deserved punishment or repression just for being what you are, who you are. Shut up, Remus spat, yanking his sword from its wooden prison and whirling to face Deceit again. But no wound can ever be healed if you keep rubbing salt in it yourself. Shut up! Another advancement, a jab at his left arm, and Deceit was on the ground again, scrambling backward across the uneven forest floor. This isn't you, Remus! This isn't you, and I know it, and if you just listen, we can work things out with the others, I promise. And I know it doesn't make up for everything you've gone through, but shut up! And the forest fell silent. The rain fell steadily, heavily, painting the dirt path a muddy gray around them as it forced its way through the treetops. The birds and their horrid calls disappeared, letting the rain sing its own dirge in the air. It was loud, loud enough with the ringing in his ears that Deceit couldn't hear his own gasp, but even the raindrops couldn't wash away the red trails that fell from his stomach. Remus stared down at him. His eyes were almost wide, eyebrows furrowed as he watched the blood fall to the forest floor and stain it a startling crimson. He followed his line of sight from the wound and found the tip of his sword painted the same red. Oh. He glanced between the rapier and Deceit's pale face, eyes widening and turning glassy. Oh, he repeated quieter, something in his voice breaking. No. He dropped to his knees and crawled to Deceit's side, hovering his hand over the stab wound. His chest rose and fell with shallow bursts, wild as his gaze as it flickered over the red still spilling over Deceit's clothes, and he met Deceit's eyes as tears spilled over his face. I'm sorry, he forced out in a choked breath. I didn't mean to do. Oh no, Dee, Remus's wide eyes snapped to him again. Pressure. What? I need you to put pressure on it. You shouldn't have removed the sword, dummy. Deceit tried a playful smile, but fire shot up from his abdomen. It wasn't his stomach, he saw when he managed to look down, but lower abdomen, a remarkably lucky place to have been stabbed, if he said so himself, and his face fell as he swallowed a cry of pain. Remus frowned, but seemed to catch on a second later as he ripped his sash off and set to tying around the wound as tightly as possible. His hands were stained red on his sash and on the ground and Deceit's gloves, and dear God, what a horrible combination it'd be with his usual yellow accents. His vision went spotty as Remus finished the knot on the makeshift tourniquet. What now? The Duke asked shakily, pleaded for instructions to fix his mistake. Deceit forced his eyes to stay open and took Remus's hand, trying to ignore how slippery it was, slick with his own blood. He could do this. He was self-preservation, and he was about to preserve some goddamn self. I think, he said, and surely he was imagining the slur to his words, because he'd never slurred his words before. Thank you. Logan knows first aid. And his world went black. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. And if you like what you hear and you want to read more, you can find the link to the fic in the description. See you next time!